Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? That question came from James G. Thompson in 1942, and may be the perfect doorway into this episode. Because World War II was not just a story about beaches and bombers in surrender ceremonies. It was also a story about the United States trying to define democracy while millions of Americans were asking who actually got to belong to it.
And that's why this episode means a lot here, because if you were to only tell World War II through D-Day, Midway, or Hiroshima, you're going to miss the pressure that the war put on American society itself. Because the war forced questions about refugees, race, labor, citizenship, and things like gender roles and expectations, as well as the appropriate amount of federal power. So then, before the country could even catch its breath, those same questions spilled into a new global rivalry with the Soviet Union.
So today we're going to tell one big story in two acts. First, the home front. What Americans knew about Nazi persecution, what they did and didn't do, and how the war opened opportunities while also exposing some pretty ugly limits. Then we're going to move into the early Cold War, where wartime alliance turns into distrust and where the United States starts building the foreign policy machinery that will define the second half of the 20th century. Okay, let's start with the Holocaust, because students often hear two versions that are both much too simple. And one version says Americans knew nothing or almost nothing. The other says that Americans knew everything and simply chose indifference. And as always, the truth is harder and more uncomfortable. And so Americans, they were relatively well informed about Nazi persecution in the 1930s. And by late 1942, major reports about the mass murder of Europe's Jews had reached the American press. But information arrived in fragments, and it was often buried among other war news, and many people struggled to grasp genocide at that scale. We were talking about this in my class the other day. I think it's so difficult to even conceive that anything on that scale is even possible. But knowing something was happening, it was not the same as fully understanding it or acting on it.
Right. And before the death camps became widely understood, the refugee crisis was already there in plain sight. The most famous symbol of that is the ship, the St. Louis. So in 1939, you had 937 passengers. Almost all Jewish refugees sailed toward Havana in Cuba, hoping eventually to reach safety. Cuba refuses them. The United States did not admit them. The ship returned to Europe, and about 254 of those passengers were later murdered in the Holocaust. That one ship has become a moral mirror, if you will, because it showed the gap between sympathy and action.
And that gap has causes, right? There's a context here. Immigration law had become more restrictive since the 1920s. Public opinion was pretty hesitant to really step in too firmly. And in January 1939, most Americans opposed accepting European refugees. So the State Department, under officials, really slowed the visa process even further in the name of national security. There was a fear of spies and just overall bureaucratic caution. So when we ask why didn't the United States do more, it's not just one cause. It's anti-immigration, there's anti-Semitism, there's economic anxiety, security fears, and really just government obstruction that all kind of tangles together to create this slow, unsettling reaction.
And that really matters on the home front because it reminds us that World War II, it was not just about fighting evil abroad. It was also about how Americans responded to other people in danger and whether democratic ideals actually translated into policy. And even the eventual War Refugee Board in 1944, which did save lives, it arrived painfully late. So the wartime home front begins not with triumph, but really with a moral hesitation.
So if you put that beside the experience of Black Americans, and there is this contradiction getting sharper and sharper. On one hand, the war opened doors. On the other, the nation remained segregated. So roughly 1.2 million Black men and women served in uniform during World War II, but they served in segregated units and under unequal conditions. So for many African Americans, the war was not just a fight against fascism. It was also a test of whether service could force America to confront its own racism.
And Hitler actually used that as a tactic against the United States, dropping pamphlets to Black soldiers about, why are you fighting for this when these freedoms and liberties aren't even extended to you at home? But this is where the double V campaign comes in, and that's a term that's important for A-pushers. This double victory means victory abroad over fascism, but also victory at home over racism. And this slogan really exploded after something called Thompson's Letter in the Pittsburgh Courier. And it captured something huge, that Black Americans did not want to be told to wait their turn after the war. They wanted the language of democracy applied now. And in reality, they wanted it a lot sooner and deserved it always. And so one of the cool details here is that the double V became more than a newspaper slogan. It showed up in beauty culture and sports and war bond drives and community events and really a whole wartime political vocabulary.
Right. James Thompson's letter was the beginning, and it really spilled into a whole period of activism. You had CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, which was founded in 1942 by an interracial group in Chicago that pioneered nonviolent direct action, which of course will become far better known a decade or so later. But this is sort of the origins of that story. So while the war is often remembered as a moment of national unity, it was at the same time a moment when civil rights began to start organizing in a more sharpened and defined way. And Black Americans were using the crisis of war to demand that the United States take its own rhetoric seriously.
And so the war itself is going to accelerate that next phase of the Great Migration, something that we have talked about since World War I. Really, this is huge. The larger Great Migration had already been transforming the country for decades, but World War II creates a second great surge. Black workers move north and west for defense jobs, shipyards, steel mills, aircraft plants. One official Labor Department account notes that the number of Black workers in defense industries tripled in the early 1940s, and that more than 1 million moved from the South to northern and western war centers. So the war didn't just change military history, it changed the actual demographic map of the United States.
Continuity. Internal migration,
Yep.
A phrase that the College Board loves. But these new opportunities, they do not erase discrimination. Black families, they found jobs, yes, but also segregated housing, a lot of workplace tension, and white backlash, just like we saw in World War I.
Continuity.
Mm-hmm. So the home front for Black Americans is really a story of movement without equality, service without full citizenship, and hope mixed with anger. And that tension is exactly why the war becomes such an important bridge in the post-war civil rights movement.
So wartime America was changing for other communities too. Native Americans saw service as an example to kind of define their space in American society. The most famous is probably the story of the Navajo Code Talkers. In 1942, the Marine Corps trained 29 Navajo men who became really the foundation of the largest code-talking program in the military. And their language became this tactical weapon, and their work was really critical in the Pacific because none of the Axis powers had any clue as to what language was being spoken or how to break down what they thought was some code. And there's something deeply ironic there, though, right? That indigenous languages that had so often been suppressed by these American assimilation policies were now suddenly treated as these priceless assets in war.
Right. And at the same time, you had labor shortages. Everybody is getting involved in the war effort. So that would actually pull Mexican workers into the Bracero program. And so this begins in 1942. The United States and Mexico create a temporary labor arrangement to bring Mexican agricultural workers into the U.S. to fill wartime shortages. So that's one of those classic wartime contradictions. Yet again, the nation needed labor desperately, so it recruited workers across the border. But many of those workers were still treated as temporary, exploitable, and disposable.
And then you get the Zoot Suit story, which really captures how wartime patriotism could turn into racialized suspicion. And we talked about that last episode with the Japanese Americans, and we'll talk about that again, right? That the Zoot Suit was a style of clothing that was popular among Mexican American, Black, and Filipino youth. And in Los Angeles in 1943, tensions exploded into what was called the Zoot Suit riots, when white servicemen attacked young people wearing that style. So even clothing became political and racial, and a suit could be read as swagger, defiance, and un-American behavior, whatever frightened people wanted it to mean.
You guys remember in the late 90s when
Zoot Suit riot.
Yeah.
Riot.
For about like a year and a half, there was this strange popularity of what do they call it? The style of music. It was swing.
Yeah, it was.
Yes,
It was
Yeah, you know.
You
It
can
was-
look up
It was a
the
group.
song. It's
It was a group
Yeah.
that did it. Yeah.
Zoot Suit Riot was the name of the song from 1997.
yeah, and for a while it was the strangest thing. People were dressing in zoot suit, like swing attire, and even at my school, my middle school in Jackson, Missouri, a teacher was teaching all of us how to swing dance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it makes no sense at all. But it was about for a year or so, and then it all just went away.
And swing music is super fun.
Yeah, it was just strange that it came back 40 years later for about a year.
It is. Okay, let's see. I'm reading about it.
This is like a podcast where someone looks stuff up.
I'm always looking things up that I'm interested in. Socrates said something along the lines of, "I know that I do not know,"
Yeah.
which means that you're always searching
Yeah.
for more truth, more knowledge, more information.
Yeah.
Not just defiant saying, "I know it all."
That's deep.
Wow.
You're very
So
Socratic.
I'm interested in this song
Maybe
and
we'll do a podcast
what it has to do
someday
with-
on the
Oh,
Zoot
just
Suit
about.
riots.
The Zoot
Well,
Suit
and not just that,
riots.
just American music tied into
Yeah, that's a good
the
idea.
American
Yeah.
culture and yeah.
Yes,
All right, so that's what
yes,
makes
yes.
this home front that we keep talking about so rich and interesting. It's not one tidy patriotic tableau. It's a country mobilizing massively for war while arguing over who counts at home, who gets trusted, who gets these jobs. And ultimately, that's a much better way to understand the war. It's a real but incomplete and powerful story, and it's full of cracks, and we have to kind of investigate those and understand what's going on beneath the surface.
Right. And let's talk about women.
Sure.
Can we,
Yeah.
can we do that? Yeah. Okay.
Finally.
Because Rosie the Riveter is essential, but Rosie can also flatten the story if we're not careful.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Rosie matters because she symbolized women stepping into war production. Once again, riveting. Do you guys know what that means? Riveting?
Riveting.
Yeah.
It means like,
I
I
know
just
what
want
it
to make sure the
means.
listeners know.
Okay.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know much about tools or any of these things,
Well,
but I know something about a different kind of.
What? Wait, what? Yeah, but rivets.
I'm
rivets.
calling you a tool.
Yeah, I get it. I got that.
But rivets are like screws and stuff that you put
Yeah.
planes together
Wouldn't
with.
call it a
and
screw.
all-
Yeah,
well,
it's more like a fastening device
a
that holds
fastener.
To hold-
metal
that's
plates
it, to put
together.
things together,
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So. That's kind of I'm a rivet of this podcast, holding it all together.
You do kind of hold it all together.
Holding it all together.
Holding it together.
So, Yeah, riveting, wielding, building ships, welding. Oh my God, welding.
You know what? You can wield a welding
torch.
equipment. Yeah, torch.
And yes, so millions of men left for military service, and so women are going to fill industrial jobs in numbers the country had never seen before. The National Park Service notes that around 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, and by 1944, women made up nearly a third of American workers.
Dang.
Yeah, wow. Go, girl.
Dang, ladies!
But this idea that women are suddenly going to work is way too simple because, women had always worked, especially working class women. I mean, we can go. How about the Lowell factory girls?
How about them?
How about them?
Right? We've got working class immigrant women that were at work for decades before. So this is continuity. Mm-hmm. So this is nothing new.
Sorry.
I don't think that's no.
No, wait. That's chronology.
Chronology.
Sorry.
We've got too
Stop
many.
getting my sayings
Too many
wrong.
catchphrases.
Sorry.
All right. So yes, working class women, black women, immigrant women, women working in agriculture. This has always been happening. But what changed was visibility and scale and the kinds of jobs that women were now allowed to take on. The iconic rosy image, often centers on an industrial workforce with this bandana and flexed arm. But really, the broader reality included clerical work, transport, nursing, auxiliary work for the military, managerial and professional, all kinds of domestic labor that was largely unpaid to keep households together while families were scattered by war.
And she's white.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we only get a narrow view by only looking at Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah. And something else interesting that the House of Representatives about a month ago, they did adopt a piece of legislation to designate a place on the National Mall in D.C. for a Rosie the Riveter monument.
Oh, nice.
But there's no funding for it
Well,
right now. But it's
important.
yeah, it's important that
It is important.
we're still looking back at history and wondering, what should we honor and when should we honor it and who should we honor?
Right. And outside of Rosie and all the contributions in industry, there were a lot of women that supported the war from factories. More than 350,000.
Oh my God, he was so loud. You guys might have just noticed Dr. Harrison got up. He's outside of the sound booth right now.
There's
He
a
had the
huge plate of
large-
glass between us, but we still hear we still
the
heard
loudest
it. Yeah.
blowing of a nose I've ever seen.
I thought he was killing a goose in there or
You
something.
couldn't
We
hear
didn't know.
that.
Yes,
No,
we could.
Well, we could.
There's
yeah.
no way the mics heard it.
Okay.
No one
Okay.
would have
Okay.
known.
It sounded something
We
like
heard
this.
it.
Wow! Wow! No, that's not really not. That wasn't good.
He was blowing his nose to the tune of Zoot Suit Riot.
Be helpful.
Okay. More than what was I saying? 350,000 American women served in uniform during World War II. Women joined auxiliary units like the WACs, the Waves, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and the Nursing Corps. The WASPs ferried planes and logged millions of miles, yet they were denied full military status during the war. So even when women crossed into spaces long coded as male, the government still tried to define their service as exceptional, temporary, and somehow not fully equal.
And if you've seen any of the manuals for the Waves and the WACs and things like that, it's so interesting the way that the government describes how women should be presenting themselves. There's a huge emphasis on, styling themselves correctly and wearing their hair down and wearing makeup. And it's just some of those old documents are fascinating. But one of the most overlooked pieces here is childcare. The war effort needed women's labor badly enough that the federal government, through something called the Langham Act, programs funded childcare centers in some communities, and that's really remarkable because the U.S. almost never does that in peacetime, but during total war it did. It's one of those moments that shows how quickly policy can shift when the nation decides that labor is a national emergency.
The story doesn't end with liberation. After the war, there's tremendous pressure for women to leave these wartime jobs and make room for the returning men. So the war didn't necessarily produce a straight line for the feminist revolution. Instead, what it did was it widened expectations and hopes. So millions of women had started to earn paychecks. They'd learned skilled work. They'd become more mobile, moving across the country, pursuing opportunities. They'd worn uniforms, and they'd organized households all alone. And they started to imagine different futures. So the war didn't settle by any means the question of gender roles, but it did destabilize it and led many people to start to question it.
Right. And I'd add one more point to that. If you go beyond the poster, you start seeing stories like black women in wartime clerical and military service, or the women in this 6888th, that's 6888, Central Postal Directory Battalion, whose labor kept soldiers connected to home. That wider lens that we have to use makes the home front much more interesting and much more honest.
So by 1945, the United States had become something new, something more powerful, more mobilized, and more globally involved. You're welcome, Woodrow Wilson, finally. And but sometimes, though, the country was painfully aware of the gap between its ideals and its realities.
That's where the perfect transition to the Cold War begins, because the Cold War doesn't just begin after World War II. Its roots are really inside of the war itself. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was always a marriage of necessity. The enemy of my enemy.
Marriage.
Is my friend.
That's from The Princess
It
Bride.
had nothing to do with it. Had
No,
nothing.
but I just took the opportunity and seized it.
All right. Well, anyways,
Marriage.
the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so since 1917, the two countries had really distrusted each other from an ideological perspective. So during the war, when they were forced to cooperate because of Hitler, it's only out of this sort of mutual necessity. And once Germany collapses, this common enemy is now gone, and those older suspicions, they come roaring back.
Right. And you know, before the war is over, the World War II, Yalta, the conference there, that is really
Yalta.
Yalta.
How y'all doing?
Doesn't make sense.
Well, it doesn't, but it's okay. This is where you can kind of see both the hope and the trouble starting to brew. This is February 1945. So you got the big three. You got Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin.
Oh, I thought you were talking about us.
Or
Nice.
us.
Nice, yeah.
Well, they're
Do you
the
think people call us that, the big three?
Oh,
Big
they
three.
have to.
When they see us walking down the
Yo,
hallway?
big three coming down the hall. I don't know
Is
why.
that how they sound?
It could be.
Kids these days say
you
the
know,
darndest things.
It could have been what they said.
Next time you see us out in these halls, you better call us the big three.
You know, I was
You better do
disappointed.
it.
I didn't hear a lot of assume the booms this week.
No,
What?
I said it
heard
in
none.
class. No, I said it in class, and everybody was like, "What?"
And you're like, yeah, we know where
Assume
your
the
allegiance
boom.
is.
Assume the boom. So I
boom.
guess they're not.
Got to leave that room
Really
to assume the
listening.
boom.
They should be.
Yeah, I'm disappointed.
Okay.
But well, they better double down on the big three thing. So what did they talk about? They met, and well, probably Stalin wanted to talk about why do you guys always like talk to you just one another and never invite me to any parties?
Oh, it's always difficult with three.
It's very mean.
You know, there's always somebody who feels left out.
right. And
Wait a second.
I think he's a good choice to leave
What are you
out.
trying to say?
Actually,
I'm talking about
we were
World
talking
War
about
II.
Stalin.
Oh, okay.
What are you
Wow.
talking
I
about?
thought you were trying to say that I was Stalin.
Listen,
No.
you know, whatever you might project outwardly about yourself is none of my business.
Yeah. It's but what did they talk about?
I'll tell you
back
what,
in the
though.
day?
Stalin, as a young man, pretty handsome.
I don't think that we should be, once again, talking about people's bodies like we did with, you know, whether good or bad. And also,
It's a compliment.
He ended up murdering, I believe, more people than the Third Reich did. So,
Yeah, just saying.
boy.
He had a nice mustache.
That was it's important contextualization.
you're about to get canceled, dog.
Dog. So what did they talk about? They talked about really Germany, like what was going to happen to Germany post World War II, but also Eastern Europe. Soviet entry into the war against Japan. That was a big deal. The United States was pretty convinced that this is something that needed to have happen, and the shape of the new United Nations. So all of these things are like being talked about. So on paper, there was still what I guess would be characterized as optimism, but there were promises about free elections that Stalin promised. Don't believe that. There was talk of cooperation. Roosevelt believed he might be able to keep wartime collaboration alive even after the war.
And so that's where the United Nations comes from. It's wrapped in that hopeful language. Quote, the UN Charter says, to have succeeding generations from the scourge of war. So after two catastrophic world wars, that idea made emotional sense, but built into the UN was also a hard realism that the great powers, including the Soviet Union and the United States, would hold vetoes in the Security Council. So even this peacekeeping institution of the post-war world contained and still contains the fingerprints of power politics.
But then Roosevelt dies in April 1945.
Moment of silence.
Oh, boy.
Okay. And then here comes Harry Truman. And he's kind of trying to navigate this tricky diplomatic situation. It's at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945 where he finds that the tone between leadership is already starting to harden. In Germany, now that they've surrendered, the Allies are really no longer held together by pressing military necessity. So instead, they start focusing on what the post-war world will look like, reparations, what happens with Poland, who occupies what, and the future of Eastern Europe. And these all become these sources of conflict. And Truman, kind of newer to the job, has less gravitas than FDR. He's really less invested in Roosevelt's personal diplomacy that he had been conducting for years now. And Truman's really suspicious of Stalin and the Soviets in general.
As well he should be. And he does have gravitas. How dare you?
Yeah, just not a lot yet.
Okay. I guess there are different kinds of gravitas. And so this is where students need to see the Cold War as a story of clashing visions. I mean, it's really basically why we call it the Cold War. It's a war of ideologies. It's not because all the fighting took place in Siberia, comrade. The United States tended to imagine a post-war world shaped by self-determination, open markets, international institutions, and Stalin wanted his own security on the Soviet frontier, which in practice meant friendly or controlled governments in Eastern Europe, kind of a buffer zone, if you will. After what the Soviet Union had suffered in the war, which was huge, nobody's going to deny that. Stalin was not going to leave the borderlands question to goodwill, and the Americans read that as expansionism. So the Soviets read American pressure as encirclement. Both sides felt defensive. Both sides acted aggressively.
And meanwhile, during all of this, China looms in the background. When World War II ended, the Chinese Civil War flared back up between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists. It had started well before that, but they took a pause, came back together to fight World War II. Now it's back on. The United States is going to back Chiang and the nationalists, but corruption, military weakness, and the political strength of the communists undermined that effort. So when Mao declared the People's Republic of China in October of 1949, many Americans interpret it as part of a single communist surge, even though Chinese communism had its own roots and dynamics different from that of the Soviet Union's.
It's important to note that Truman caught a lot of flack for this, and there's a growing sense in the United States that there needs to be a more direct approach to handling communism, and that perhaps Truman isn't the guy to do it. So it's this looming issue that's really going to hang over Truman, this issue of communism spreading. And not just Truman, but all of the American government, because way before the Korean War, American officials were already asking, are we going to have to start worrying about the post-war world slipping away piece by piece? First, it's China, but what's next? What about Eastern Europe? All of this was on the table, and the fear helped make Cold War policy broader, sharper, and ultimately more global.
Now enter George Kennan. Kennan is one of those names students should actually remember because he helps explain the logic of containment. If you guys want to sum up the Cold War, 1946 all the way through the late 80s with one word, the word should be containment. So in 1946, Writing from Moscow, he argues that the Soviet power was not just random aggression, it was ideological, suspicious, and deeply concerned with security. He famously describes it as impervious to the logic of reason but highly sensitive to the logic of force. That's a chilling phrase, and it points toward a strategy. And you gotta think about this as containing what? Containing a virus, containing a disease. I think that's the best analogy that we can use with this. And you can't try to charm the Soviets into friendship. You got to contain them patiently, firmly, and over time.
And there's something very important here. Kennan's original containment idea was not fight communism everywhere with unlimited force forever. It was not that. It started as a long game aimed at key centers of power, but once politicians got a hold of containment and once crises kept piling up, the strategy became more sweeping than Kennan initially imagined.
Kennan's pseudonym was Agent X.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet.
Yeah. Agent X. That's really
It's a pretty good
cool.
All right, so the first big test case of this strategy of containment comes in Greece, of all places. But really it's because Britain had been exhausted after the war and had told Washington, look, we can't support the Greek government anymore. It's got this civil war going on, and Turkey's in a similar difficult position. It looked like communism was trying to spread in both of those locations. And so Truman, especially as perceptions of whether or not he was a strong leader, he seizes the moment. In March 1947, he told Congress that it must be the policy of the United States to, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. And so that becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, and it marks a really major shift. The United States is no longer thinking like a nation that can step back into isolation after victory. Instead, it's starting to make the United States think of itself as a permanent global guarantor or protector of freedom.
And then comes the Marshall Plan, which is like the Truman Doctrine on steroids. And it really shows the policy of containment working through economics, not just military means. And so Europe, as we know, in 1947 was battered, hungry, politically fragile, and economically shaky following the war. So American policymakers feared that misery would feed communist parties in Western Europe, kind of like how the fascists rose in the 30s. Like, bad situations will lead to radical policies, according to surely the American government and other Western European governments. So Secretary of State George Marshall is going to propose massive aid for recovery. And over time, Congress is going to approve of over $12 billion to rebuild industry, stimulate trade, and tie Western Europe much more closely to the United States.
So in other words, containment wasn't only about drawing military lines. It was also about making sure that democratic capitalism, with a capital C, looked functional, prosperous, and worth defending. So food shipments, fuel, machinery, reconstruction loans, those became Cold War weapons as well. And that is such an push point. Economics and ideology are forever entwined here.
And then Berlin raises the stakes again because Stalin looks to block access to West Berlin. Remember that Germany has been divided east and west. And the Soviets control eastern Germany, which includes the all-important city of Berlin, which has now also been divided east and west. So Truman sees this as a testing ground, right? And he refuses to abandon West Berlin, but he doesn't want war outright. So the United States decides instead to send its supplies to Berlin by air, Operation Vittles.
Vittles.
Get you some vittles.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
You know where vittles comes from? The word vittles.
I feel like we've talked about this before.
It's from the derivation is from victuals.
We talked about this last year.
I think we
right.
did.
That's good.
I think about that every time.
Well, it's true. That's a good piece of trivia.
More like a great piece of trivia.
Great piece of trivia.
Yeah, it was pretty great.
Well, I'll tell you
I'm
what,
not gonna lie.
Operation Vittles does the job. And eventually West Berlin secures its place. So we know that the Soviets will turn to building a wall there to keep the separation intact. But for now, the crisis is going to harden, and this division of Europe becomes more and more pronounced and convinces many leaders that Western Europe needs a formal military alliance.
And that alliance is going to be Wait for it.
Okay.
NATO.
NATO.
NATO. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance that still exists today. And this was the first peacetime military alliance that the U.S. had entered outside of the Western Hemisphere. And the core idea is huge. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. This is both a continuity and a change because we tried this with the League of Nations. Remember, Article 10 said this exact same thing, and we said no. The Senate said we will not do that. That will take away American sovereignty to get involved in foreign conflicts. So no in 1918, 1919. But now we're saying yes to this. This is the United States planting itself permanently in European security, and George Washington change is rolling over in his grave.
He's not happy.
He is not happy. He said, do not get yourself permanently involved in European security. But we do it. And later, when West Germany enters NATO, the Soviet Union formalized its own alliance through the Warsaw Pact in 1955. So Europe was no longer just recovering. It was now divided into armed camps on one side, NATO, on the other side, the Warsaw Pact.
And so 1949 comes, delivers two massive shocks that hit Washington like a hammer. It's hammer time. First, you have the Soviet Union testing its first atomic bomb. Kaboom. Second, Mao, it was louder than that. Second, Mao's communists win China. And that's huge, right? Because everybody's like, oh, Truman lost China. Oh, my God, what are we going to do? So
good thing his reelection had been before that, which he almost lost.
Right. But you know what? What else? Maybe we're going to talk about this. He desegregates the military
He does, in 1948.
right before his election.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, let's go, boy. He's my boy.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, boy. So suddenly American leaders are no longer imagining the Soviet Union as a power that the United States can safely outrun with a temporary nuclear monopoly. That ain't going to happen anymore. And try to contain with modest measures. The mood gets a little dark here.
Yeah, and that darker mood shows up in the famous NSC 68, National Security Council Order 68. It's a document in 1950 that is one of the most important Cold War texts that we should kind of make sure we understand. And it argues that, look, the Soviet threat, it's worldwide. We no longer can retreat into isolationism. The United States needs a massive military buildup, and this is where containment is going to become broader and more intense. It's also going to suggest that there are threats within the United States that we must be aware of, and we can't just rely on patience anymore. It's about direct mobilization, increased budgets. We need a mass buildup of weapons. An arms race is about to begin, and it's really a permanent national security state.
And I think that's a good endpoint for us in this episode because World War II had already taught the federal government how to mobilize on a gigantic scale. And the Cold War keeps that machinery alive, right? The National Security Act creates the NSC, National Security Council, and the CIA. It reorganizes defense. We now combine Department of War and the Army and the Navy into just the Department of Defense as an umbrella. And it gives the president a much larger national security apparatus. And so one of the biggest continuities between wartime and the Cold War is it's institutional, right? That emergency power becomes normal power. All these things are normal to us now today. The National Security Council,
Right.
which lives in the White House, the CIA, the Department of the Defense or Department of War, whatever it's being called now. It's part of our daily lives. And we hear about it constantly.
For sure. And I think what's up next for us then is to kind of think about how the Cold War is going to shape domestic life and everyday life for Americans in the 1950s. So
I
that's,
have in my hand a list of 200 and something communists in the State Department.
Yeah, exactly.
In the state.
What a
you
nice-
gotta say he's from
nice little
Wisconsin,
teaser.
so
Nice little teaser for us. So thanks for tuning in to A Push for All. If you like the episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube, and leave us a review. Let us know if you got a topic you want us to cover, or send us a message on Instagram at A Push for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.